Only ever by grace did Tolkien believe he was admitted to Faerie. Only ever by grace had he come and gone since he was a young man in the trenches of World War I, when he had first begun to set things down to accompany the elven languages he was developing, and later, as he convalesced back in England with his beloved Edith looking after him. What wondrous light-filled days they must have been, paradoxically, for they existed hand in hand with great grief and loss, and yet the comings and goings went on until midlife and beyond, and it must have seemed as if they would go on forever. But it was not to be, and eventually the light dimmed and his excursions became fewer and fewer, until at last they were no more. Then there was only the memory of what had been. It was then that the short tale of Smith of Wootton Major came to him, and he set it down in earnest. It was to be the last tale he wrote before his death in 1973. Some say it's autobiographical in a way. Who knows? It certainly concerns the adventures of one such soul, the Smith's son, fortunate to come and go between Faerie and the everyday world by means of a Fae star hidden in a children's party cake. And it concerns the necessity too, many years later, of giving up that star so that another might know its magic. The story takes place in the little village of Wootton Major, to be distinguished, we are told, from its neighbour, Wootton Minor. It was an ordinary place, with ordinary folk living ordinary lives, or so it appeared to those looking on. And yet there were goings-on in that little place that only few had an inkling of. Every 24 years, for example, a great cake was baked by the master cook, and 24 hand-picked children were invited to attend a celebration at the great hall and to be treated to one of the coveted slices. Now this festival was known as the 24 Feast, and the great cake was its centrepiece. Wootton Major was famous for its cooking, and most especially its cakes, and on this occasion the master cook was expected to create a cake to rival all that had gone before. When the time came to begin the preparations, Cook sat in his chair pontificating as to how the cake should be. "It must be sweet and pretty and fairy-like," he said to Prentice, his assistant. "And there should be a little doll, dressed all in white, with a little wand in her hand, ended with a tinsel star, standing on a kind of miniature mountain. Yes, with little trees at the side, and the words Fairy Queen written in pink icing around her feet." So it was decided, and preparations proceeded apace. Now there was a tradition of stirring tiny trinkets, coins and the like, into the cake mix. Cook remembered an old box where they had been stored from before. He asked Prentice to fetch it, and together they inspected the contents. There was one bright trinket that shone out amongst the rest, and Cook said straight away that he would add it to the cake. "Yes," agreed Prentice, "it's the right thing to do, master. It's a Fae star." "A Fae star, Prentice? What are you talking about, boy?" "It comes from Faerie, master." Cook thought Prentice a little odd, and nothing further was said. Well, the day of the feast soon came around. The great cake, made mainly by Prentice, it must be said, was presented to everyone's delight, and a great number of children enjoyed it and found little trinkets in their slices and marvelled at the pretty fairy queen perched on top of the icing mountain. But as for the silver face star, no one knew what became of it, except a few months later, a little boy called Smith, the son of the local smithy, began behaving most uncharacteristically. Previously, he had been a rather awkward boy who couldn't quite carry a tune, but now he sang most eloquently and danced little dances to amuse himself, as if born to the art. On his 10th birthday, he had got up before dawn and set off into the woods nearby, singing as he was now wont to do. And in that moment the little silver face star fell out of his mouth and into his open hand. Instinctively he clapped his hand to his head, and there the face star stayed in the middle of his forehead. And on that day, with the star shining brightly, he walked right into the realm of Faerie, and he was welcome there, and as safe as any mortal can be in that perilous realm. And the next day, and the next day after that, the young lad set forth with a spring in his step, humming his little tunes. At first he walked quietly among the gentlefolk of that region, in the outer realms of Faerie, and by the bright waters in which at night strange stars shone, and at dawn the gleaming peaks of distant mountains were mirrored. Some of his briefer visits he spent looking only at one tree or one flower, but later, on longer walks, he ventured deeper and deeper in, and he saw things of both beauty and terror. And so time passed, and the young boy grew to manhood and became a master smith, and he married Nell, his childhood sweetheart, and they had 2 children, Ned and Nan. And that, says Tolkien, was all most people knew about him. But there was, of course, much more to know. For Smith had become acquainted with Faerie, and some regions of it he knew as well as any mortal can, though he spoke of this to few people except his wife and children. From them it could not have been kept secret anyway, for they sometimes saw the star gleaming on his forehead when he came back from one of his long walks. Now on one such journey, climbing into the outer mountains, he came to a deep lake, and it seemed that he could see to an immeasurable depth. Filled with wonder, he went down to the water's edge, but it was not water. It was harder than stone and sleeker than glass, and when he stepped on it, he fell heavily, and a ringing boom ran across its surface and echoed at its shores. And then the breeze rose to a wild wind, and it swept him up to the slopes, whirling and falling like a dead leaf. He put his arms around the stem of a young birch and clung to it, and the wind wrestled fiercely with them, trying to tear him away. But the birch bent down to the ground and enclosed him with its branches. When at last the wind passed on, he rose and saw that the birch was naked. It was stripped of every leaf, and it wept, and tears fell from its branches like rain. And as he climbed out of that dale, He felt the tears of the birch trickle down his face, and they were bitter on his lips. His heart was saddened as he went on his long road, and for some time he did not enter Faerie again. But he could not forsake it, and when he returned, his desire was still stronger to go deep into that land. And he found a road then that led from the outer mountains to the inner mountains, and they were high and sheer and daunting. And after many days of walking, he came finally, though he did not know it, to the Vale of Evermorn. And as he set foot upon the grass, he heard elven voices singing, and on a lawn beside a river bright with lilies, he came upon many maidens dancing. Then suddenly they stood still, and a young maiden with flowing hair stepped forward to greet him. "You are becoming bold, Starbrow, are you not?" she laughed. "Have you no fear of what the Queen might say if she knew? Did you imagine that the star on your forehead gave you liberty to go wherever you wished?" "Yes," he replied, "I did think that. And now I know," he said, realizing his error, "that it does not." "Come, Starbrow," said the maiden, "take my hand and come into the ring." And she drew him deep and deeper in, and they danced and danced and danced, and for a while he knew what it was to have the swiftness and the power to accompany her. Yet all too soon it was over, and in parting, the beautiful maiden presented him with a tiny white flower as a keepsake of their meeting. "Maybe we shall meet again, by the Queen's leave." Time passed. Days, weeks, years. Cook retired, Prentice became master cook, and soon it was time for the next 24 feast. And it was about this time that Smith ventured into Faerie for the last time. On that occasion, he had received a summons and had made a far journey. Longer it seemed to him than any he had yet made. He was guided and guarded, but he had little memory of the ways that he had taken, for often he had been blindfolded by mist and shadow, until at last he came to a high place under a night sky of innumerable stars. And there he was brought before the Queen herself. She wore no crown and had no throne. She stood there in her majesty and glory, and all about her was a great host, shimmering and glittering like stars above. But she was taller than the points of their great spears, and upon her head there burned a white flame. She made a sign for him to approach, and trembling he stepped forward. A high, clear trumpet sounded, and behold, they were alone. He stood before her, and he did not kneel in courtesy, for he was dismayed, and felt that for one so lowly, all gestures were in vain. At length he looked up and beheld her face, and her eyes bent gravely upon him, and he was troubled and amazed, for in that moment he knew her again, the fair maid of the Vale of Evermorn, the dancer who had given him the beautiful flower. She smiled, seeing his memory, and drew toward him, and they spoke long together, for the most part without words, And he learned many things in her thought, some of which gave him joy, and others filled him with grief. Then his mind turned back, retracing his life, until he came to the day of the children's feast and the coming of the star, and suddenly he saw again the little dancing figure with its wand, and in shame he lowered his eyes from the queen's beauty. But she laughed again, as she had in the vale of Evermorn. "Do not be aggrieved for me, Starbrow," she said, "nor too much ashamed of your own folk. Better a little dull, maybe, than no memory of Faerie at all. For some the only glimpse, for some the awakening. Ever since that day you have desired in your heart to see me, and I have granted your wish, but I can give you no more. Now kneel of your courtesy." Then he knelt, and she stooped and laid her hand upon his head, and a great stillness came upon him, and he seemed to be both in the world and in Faerie, and also outside them and surveying them, so that he was at once in bereavement and in ownership and in peace. When after a while the stillness passed, he raised his head and stood up. The dawn was in the sky and the stars were pale, and the queen was gone. Yet ever after he kept the beautiful flower she had given him from the vale of Evermorn. It did not wither nor grow dim, and they kept it in his family as a secret and a treasure. And he made a little casket with a key for it, and there it lay, and was handed down for many generations in his kin. And those who inherited the key would at times open the casket and look long at the living flower, till the casket closed again. The time of its shutting was not theirs to choose.